All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing with our tafsir. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُم بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. But just to review some of the things that we talked about yesterday. The day before yesterday, we talked about the difference between أعرض or الإعراض and التولي. That was the day before yesterday. We went in some details with that one. And we also yesterday went with the details of نصحت لكم ولكن لا تحبون الناصحين. We talked about nasiha and why wasn't it affecting them. And we said that there are two things that are related to one another, which is we're talking about hidayat irshad and hidayat tawfiq. Sometimes the practices that and the lifestyle that a person might live in and might embrace may affect the person's ability to embrace hidayat al-irshad. And we said hidayat al-irshad basically means the guidance in basically embracing the information, in processing the information / the revelation that was revealed. Hidayat al-tawfiq would be guidance that one gets, but then is applied guidance. So think of it as applied guidance versus the first one is guidance through information. So informed guidance and applied guidance. So when you look at the relationship between these two, sometimes the informed guidance may sometimes one get misunderstood or may not sometimes get processed or may sometimes not seem like it makes sense or affect the person's ability to hold on to such vision / aqidah. And certainly sometimes the obstacle to why that is at stake may sometimes be in the applied guidance, meaning the lifestyle that the person is living in, whether we're speaking about lifestyle in what they're consuming in terms of food or perhaps maybe drinking, or probably the relationship, let's call it the social dynamic, or perhaps maybe even the money, or maybe even all these put together. We're speaking about the different things that may affect the person's ability to process all that information or all that, let's call it the visual guidance, let's call it the informed guidance, let's call it the revelation guidance, to basically get consumed or absorbed or processed within the brain and the heart. So sometimes that's a relationship that our behavior can affect the way we process information. So keep that one in mind. Our behavior includes what we say, what we look at, what we listen to, what we basically put ourselves into as a dynamic, meaning environment that we're in. And certainly all of that may affect our ability to absorb, to process, to embrace, and to certainly take in all that revelation or that informed guidance, and it may be really as a result of the behavior. That actually reminds me of what well, it was said it was a Shafi'i, but it wasn't a Shafi'i because Waki' is a different scholar. So what was it? He said, شكوت إلى وكيع سوء حفظي فأرشدني إلى ترك المعاصي وأخبرني بأن العلم نور ونور الله لا يهدى لعاصي. What was it? It's a poem that this student complained to his teacher that he is struggling to memorize the Quran or memorize the ilm, and then his instructor, his sheikh, his name is Waki', he guided him to leaving and abandoning basically sin. And he told him that sin acts as an obstacle from getting and absorbing the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, since ilm is the light of Allah. So if a person is having a challenge or struggling to memorize, struggling to seek ilm, struggling to go to the masjid, struggling to find khushu' in their salah, struggling to stay connected with the deen, then in that situation, you might want to change your environment. You might want to change your habits in perhaps your entertainment and what you're looking at, what you're listening to, what area you're working in. You might need to review some of those areas that are dragging you and acting as a gravity to take you into that addiction, and definitely can affect your ability to absorb, let's call it that revelation, information, that visual guidance slash aqidah. So therefore, we were talking about these two as لَقَدْ أَبْلَغْتُكُمْ رِسَالَةَ رَبِّي. In other words, they were informed. That's one piece of that information. But in order to help them process this information, they needed a nasiha. What is in nasiha? In nasiha is a direction. In nasiha is giving you the information to help guide you to be able to distinguish between right and wrong, to be able to distinguish what to apply in life. And certainly your experience is not enough to help you distinguish right and wrong. Your experience on its own is going to lack whether data or going to lack the vision in order to see the parameters of everything that's surrounding, whether we're speaking about in the long term or whether we're speaking about short term, or whether we're speaking about within your body and how that will affect the parameters within your body, looking at your mind, looking at your body, looking at your ruh, your soul, and looking at your heart. So think of it as just different dynamics, considering the different angles, considering the different dimensions that will affect what decisions you might be taking, what role you might be behaving in and practicing. And therefore, when you look at وَنَصَحْتُ لَكُمْ, we said the word nasiha can mean to distract the pure honey from all the different crust or perhaps the different substances that may be in that honeycomb. So then you're basically trying to take out and distract the honey away from all the different pieces of crust and the honeycomb there. So you're trying to get the purest part of it. And in order to get the purest behavior, in order to get the purest substance, whether we're speaking about purest substance or in this context, that would be the purest behavior. So if you're looking at a pure behavior, then that's what you. If you're looking at a pure behavior, you definitely would need some instruction to help you recognize what it means to find and apply a pure behavior. So therefore, our own experience is not enough to find and have that information and to recognize what's a pure behavior, what's not a pure behavior, because your mind is incapable of separating itself and separating you. And basically your brain is basically a process in how it processes different experiences, different data, different visions on how it understands different things. And therefore, since you're not able to separate yourself from all of those influences, then surely you're not going to be able to come to a subjective finding, a subjective informed nasiha to basically help you make the right decisions. So we definitely will see this one, لَقَدْ أَبْلَغْتُكُمْ رِسَالَةَ رَبِّي, meaning and referring to things that relate to aqidah, things that relate to your relationship with Allah, who created you, where you heading in life, what is the purpose of life, what was the that information that you needed to know in order to basically continue with the life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already considered the purpose of existence before you had even existed. In other words, it is beyond the matter that you basically are living in. This is outside of matter. This is something that is not within matter. This is outside of life itself. So therefore, you needed some information to be sent by Allah Almighty. And certainly that information is not only including information as who is your creator, where you're heading, etc., but it needed instructions to help you also recognize what you need to apply and what the accountability is based on. Okay, ولكن لا تحبون الناصحين. How did they get to the level of not liking somebody that gives the nasiha? It's basically the arrogance. So arrogance is what affects their heart from seeing the ilm, whether we're speaking about الرسالة or even applying the ilm, and therefore ولكن لا تحبون الناصحين is letting us know that it was arrogance that acted as the main obstacle. Then we went into وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ. Then we went into basically talking about Prophet Lut alayhi salam. And when we talked about Prophet Lut, we basically went to this book right there. Let's look at it really quick. We went to this book right there, and that book basically was giving us certain information about the names, and certainly it was not preceded by different scholars. So that was mainly his findings and his job, that he basically related the names and the story and how it was laid out in the Quran, and the relationship between the names and certain parts of the ayat, etc., in order for us to remember that. But most of the names, in fact, all the names of the prophets are not Arabi, and therefore they're not conjugated from Arabi word, meaning that they are simply a'lamun a'jamiyya, meaning that they are not Arabi words, and therefore they cannot be conjugated. So in order for us to learn the name and to learn details about the name, we have to recognize that the name is not Arabi, and therefore understand something in it. The other thing that we wanted to talk about was really the story of Prophet Lut alayhi salam. We did translate really quick. So we said the story of Prophet Lut alayhi salam in Surah, at least Al-A'raf, is just really, let's count those ayat. So we've got, this is ayah number 1, this is ayah number 2, and then number 3 and 4 and 5. So we only have 5 ayat about Prophet Lut in Surah Al-A'raf. We definitely have a lot more, just different excerpts here and there in different surahs, such as, let's see, Surah Al-Dhariyat, we've got to mention right there. Surah Al-Ankabut, got to mention right there. What else? So, we don't have that many. Oh, Surah Al-An'am, we have a mention right there. So just a couple times that Prophet Lut alayhi salam was mentioned, but none of them were very detailed. Oh, we also have Surah Al-Shu'ara as well. So we got some details here and there, but not something as explicit as Prophet Musa alayhi salam. That for sure. No other prophet had the explicit and details that the details that were mentioned as Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Not any prophet had the amount of information that was mentioned as much as Prophet Musa alayhi salam, with Surah Al-Qasas, Surah Taha, Surah Al-Shu'ara, and certainly even we're going to see that there's a lot of details as well in Surah Al-Araf. We're going to see that as well. So when we're looking at least Prophet Lut alayhi salam, got some information right there. So let's see. Al-Qurtubi said that there were 4 different matters that he basically found in regards to Prophet Lut alayhi salam. And number 1, he said, Lutan إذ قال لقومه. He said Lut is, according to some scholars, was actually conjugated, and certainly other scholars, we did this yesterday, other scholars objected, and they said this is not an Arabic word, therefore you cannot say that it was conjugated, and we actually left off at this one. أتأتون الفاحشة يعني إتيان الذكور. So what is الفاحشة? أتأتون, do you commit الفاحشة? What is الفاحشة? And what does that fahisha look like? what was happening. Is that exclusive to a particular practice, or is that a number of different practices right there? So what is al-fahisha? He said, do you commit al-fahisha, which is basically right there, according to al-Qurtubi, he said it basically is ityan al-dhukur. It was basically having sexual relations, male to male sexual relations. So that was their act that was committed by the people of Qawm Lut. But here's the question. If that was the case, and it said right there, gives a further explanation what this fahisha looks like, and when the ayah said, إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ بل أنتم قوم مسرفين. But the question is, it said, ما سبقكم بها من أحد من العالمين. No other nation had come with this kind of act or this kind of behavior ever before you. But is that at all necessarily proven that there was not a single nation that came with this action? In other words, no other human behavior was recorded, or that we know at all that any humans committed such an act before Qawm Lut? Or is that actually speaking about it differently? So I needed to go to a different book. Now, this book, I managed to basically be so lucky to get this book. And let's say this book, we're going to go to page 210. Well, this is it, but I need to show you what that book is. This book was actually not yet published. Okay, this book is not yet published. And well, wait a minute. No, it was published, but I basically am lucky to get a copy of it. Okay, this is leaked information, and the book is called شبهات تاريخية حول القرآن. So basically, the different misconceptions around the Quran, and the author goes in certain details. This is the author right there. It was actually published by this institute, or I'm not sure if it's an institute or if it's a publishing company, but anyhow, they do a lot of da'wah. This is the place. And certainly, the nice thing is that within this book, what the author does is that he goes around and scrutinizes the different pieces of information that some, whether archaeologists, historians, or perhaps maybe anthropologists or different people that objected about the stories that relate to history, that relate to archaeology, and basically bring about these misconceptions about the Quran. And you could say the author basically introduces these misconceptions and then puts out the rebuttals against these misconceptions. So, of course, let's just look at some of the information. The book, like I said, you can actually buy it from that Rawasih company. Some of those misconceptions, whether we're speaking about that prophethood is only exclusive to men, or whether it's talking about the Queen of Saba, why don't we have any archaeological artifacts? Do we have anything? What about some of the names, etc.? So you could see Quraysh, is he Dhul Qarnayn? Who's actually Quraysh? Who's Uzair? Do the Jews really say that Uzair is the son of God, or who's actually saying that? Yusuf al-Najjar, or basically the Yusuf al-Najjar, the Joseph the carpenter, and some stories about that, and basically refuting a number of different things. But what we care about is, at least within our story of what we want to know, is this one. Is it true that Qawm Lut, there was no other nation that had committed such an aberration whatsoever, or is it a mistake, or let's call it a mistake that the Quran had basically come up with? What is that? What is that misconception? So the misconception that someone may say, well, wait a minute, this is not proven that there was no group of people to commit such an aberration? So here's the answer. So he comes in and he says, well, here's the answer to this. He said, in general, we don't have any evidence to prove that this action before, that is the third century, basically, that there was any behavior that was done in relationship to committing gayism, to committing any of such same-sex relations. We don't have any evidence, in other words, archaeological evidence to prove that, but despite that, that is not to necessarily say that Qawm Lut are the only ones to basically commit that, because the ayah, as we could see, it says, إنكم لتأتون الفاحشة ما سبقكم بها من أحد من العالمين. And then certainly, أئنكم لتأتون الرجال وتقطعون السبيل وتأتون في ناديكم المنكر. So that would mean that there was a particular practice that they were exclusive in doing. So in other words, it could have been possible that there were other people that may have practiced this aberration, may have done this kind of crime, but in the combination of such a practice, one, which is make it as a general community agreement to committing this crime, was something that was not necessarily known. So we'll have individual cases that might have been done here and there, but as a community, to agree on such a crime, to agree to tolerate such a crime, including تقطعون السبيل, including perhaps commit other crimes of maybe as piracy, perhaps maybe even affecting reproduction. What does that look like? Or even تأتون في ناديكم المنكر. So it wasn't just a practice, that individual practice done behind doors, but it was something that they were publicly doing. They were inviting. It was more of تأتون في ناديكم المنكر. It was a practice that the whole society had tolerated. It was a practice that the whole society within that group of people was actually considered as something that was supposed to be, or that they had seen it as something that is acceptable and totally acceptable. So the other part, so now we're looking at the first objection, or the first rebuttal. He basically said that this is referring, that il-fahisha was not only referring to that gayism practice or that gay practice, but this is also referring to all the different actions done all together, whether we're speaking about making it a public behavior, or whether we're speaking about tolerating such a crime, or whether we're speaking about, of course, objecting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now we're saying that this was something that needed scrutiny, that needed exposure once it basically became the public action, once it became tolerated by the whole society, and therefore leaving women, and certainly preventing, in this situation, preventing the reproduction and certainly the nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world in. Now, the other thing is that we can see that the Quran didn't necessarily mention a specific nation and leave out others. So this was actually talking about exactly the way how Prophet Musa alayhi salam, when Prophet Musa alayhi salam, he basically had mentioned اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جعل فيكم أنبياء وجعلكم ملوكا وآتاكم ما لم يؤتي أحدا من العالمين, to actually mean that this is not to say that this was exclusive, but sometimes certain ayat may say something to basically present it to these group of people in order to let them know, let's call it the momentum, the act and the behavior, or even the circumstance that they're putting themselves in, and put it within, let's call it the structure, or put it within the context, and put it within the practice, if we we were to make this as, what we might say, Kant will say that this is a universal maxim. If this was practiced universally, if this was a practice that everyone was practicing, then in that situation, it will definitely be an atrocity and definitely be a loss to humanity by ending reproduction, and certainly it will be wasting an energy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in nature. And certainly this basically, as Ibn Taymiyyah had explained, and you could see the author quoted right here, he said, well, this could actually mean that this was within that society, within that generation, within that time in history, that there was no other nation to do it within that time of history, and not necessarily previous times and generations, or previous times in history, or later times in history. That doesn't necessarily mean that includes everybody, but it may be that during that time in history, the only nation to practice such an aberration was basically Qawm Lut. No, at that time, no other group of people were committing that on the whole face of planet Earth. So that could be one of those interpretations. Okay, now we go back to that ayah right there, since we wanted to make sure that we cover this piece of it in order to make sure we don't confuse our pieces of information. So if you look at أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ, so is al-fahisha necessarily exclusive to the aberration of gayism, same sex, or is this also including the different practices? We can see إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ, that they were basically approaching men with lust instead of approaching women. Does that mean we're speaking about any woman that they can approach? No, we're speaking about marriage, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically approving, that is the only way for reproduction, that is the only permissible way to basically let that sexual desire be processed in. It would only be through marriage only. So when you look at bal antum qawmun musrifun, as you are basically a group of people that would be musrifun. What is al-israf? Al-israf basically means wasting energy. If you say a musrif, whether we're speaking about wasting energy, how does wasting energy come within this? So if we're looking at the word israf, we talked about this before, so I'll just remind you of some of the things that we talked about israf. And just a few days ago, we talked about israf, that it is exceeding the limit in using different resources. So whether we're speaking about money resources, or whether we're speaking about different potentials that you were given, if that potential or that resource was put in a place that is not going to serve the interest of what it was made for, that would be israf. Simple. It would be israf. So the word israf is a lot more comprehensive than making it exclusive to money. Any form of resource, any form of potential, any form of blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made that, let's use the word energy. Then in that situation, you basically have to invest it in what brings good to the individuals, to the society, and certainly do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that even if the man were to put a morsel of food in his wife's mouth, he would basically get the reward for it. Even if it was just a morsel of food in her mouth, that he would basically get the reward for it. Okay, now let's look at this one.
Sorry, Dr. Aisha, I just have a
Go ahead,
question
dear.
before we proceed.
Go ahead.
Okay, so speaking of the gayism we're talking about now, I think there is more, I don't want to say backlash or haramness between male gayism and female. So am I wrong, or is there
I'm
like a
going to
stack?
talk about that later on, inshallah. We're going to
Okay,
get to
okay,
it. So I'm just
okay.
scrutinizing one word at a time, inshallah. But we're going to talk about lesbianism and we're going to talk about gayism and Islam's view on that, or at least the scholars as well, and what they had to say about that. So stay tuned for that, inshallah. Okay, so let's see right now. أتأتون الفاحشة ما سبقكم بها من أحد من العالمين. So the question is, what is الفاحشة? Before we relate it to the other preceding ayah, let's look at the word al-fahisha and what that actually means, because we need to go back to the Lugha Arabiya. So that's why I basically got a very good article right there, which you can actually translate. Simple. You press this little thing right there and you basically translate it, and it gives you all of, a very good translation, 75% accuracy, or perhaps even more. Pretty good. Good deal. Okay, so this website, you can see aluka.net did an outstanding job in putting in revised articles, really academic articles by great students of ilm or by great scholars as well. And they basically did the job for me. I don't have to start over and, do the job by myself. But no, the article is there, did an outstanding academic article to give me just that word. Why do I even need to just know that word? Because before we do any tafsir, we always have to go back and remember that the Quran is in Lugha Arabiya. In order to understand the Quran, you have to go back to the foundation of Lugha Arabiya in the Arabic language to make sure you're understanding the Quran the way that the Prophet ﷺ had explained it, the way that the Sahaba understood it in, and you want to make sure that you have the right understanding. Well, in order to make sure that I have the right understanding, and that's why I would basically go, what is al-fahisha? What does it mean? So they did a really good job, even though it said حكم الفاحشة في القول والفعل, but they also did a really good job in explaining the word fahisha at least in the beginning. Let's see, Ibn Mandur. Who's Ibn Mandur? He's a scholar. He did a huge book. It's called Lisan al-Arab, and it's in almost, give or take, almost 15 volumes. And it's a huge, just the 15 volumes, this is just considered a dictionary. This is considered a Arabi dictionary in 15 volumes. Just imagine that. Okay. Now, what did he say? He said, Al-fuhsh and al-fahisha. He said it is anything that is disgusting or not appropriate in words and action, and the plural of it is al-fawahish. Well, now you could say, now we know, okay, anything that is al-qabih. Well, that still is leaving it ambiguous. What is qabih? What is something that is ugly, something that is inappropriate, something that is disgusting? What does that look like? So that's why we needed to go further. And الراغب basically said, well, al-fuhsh basically is to be defined as anything that is inappropriate in words and actions, and therefore still we could see that it's still ambiguous. And it was said that al-fuhsh is anything that, let's call it a person that is acting in the right behavior, somebody that is acting in based on, let's call it piety, has good integrity. If this person with that good integrity is feeling wanting to separate himself, and they're disgusted of it, and certainly a person with good mind and with a good sanity and basically has a good integrity, and they would see it as something that is not acceptable, then in that situation, that's not acceptable. I want you to look at this one. This is very important to see. You could see Al-Jurjani is helping us know that in certain times, if you're not sure whether something is acceptable or not, or whether something is appropriate or not, you would want to see people that have tabi' salim, people that have good integrity, and people that have aql mustaqim, people that have good vision, people that have good and let's call it a level of wisdom. You would want to go back to them in order to inquire, is this something that is appropriate? And this is very important to keep in mind that sometimes if you're in doubt of something, you're going to go to the Salihin and ask them, is this something that you would see as appropriate? And many times people would ask me, is piercing permissible? And I would say, well, I mean, there's nothing in the Quran and Sunnah that says that it's haram, except one thing that you need to look into. And you really need to take that in consideration. That when the Prophet ﷺ was speaking about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had cursed النامصة والمتنمصة الفالجة والمتفلجة and الواشم والمستوشمة, and it is explained by the scholars that the reason why he was talking about such cosmetic behaviors is because it was a practice that was practiced by the people that were known to lacking akhlaq, lacking mannerisms, or at least people that were behaving in inappropriate ways. And those were some of their attires, some of their ways of exposing their availability for, you know what I mean, that they would dress in a certain way, they would design their eyebrows in a certain way, they would appear in certain appearances, and that's a way to let others know their availability for an inappropriate action, and you know what I mean. So that's for us to learn that there are certain behaviors that when you want to know whether this is appropriate or not, you want to go back to the scholars. You want to go back to the Salihin. And that's the same thing that I would say. When people would ask me, is piercing haram or halal? I would say, if you were to see me pierced, with tongue piercing, nose piercing, all of that, would you at all come to ask me such a question? And they said no. I would say, why not? They would know because I would feel that your religious integrity is lacking. And that's exactly right. That's the answer to that question. You recognize by the practice that if you find a sheikha to behave in such a behavior that it is not appropriate, then in that situation you would. So therefore, if they recognize that a person with one طبع سليم, a behavior that is doing the right behavior, that is basically living their life based on religious integrity, or a person that is trying to put their vision based on Quran and Sunnah, and that they find it as not appropriate, or they find it as something they want to separate from, then in that situation, that's a way to know what fuhsh is. Let's see right there. Another definition, they said it is every behavior that would be considered as the climax of whether we're speaking about sin or whether we're speaking about aberration, whether this was something said or a behavior done. So anything that would be considered as the climax, or at least something that is high in its level of aberration or high in its level of sin, that would be considered fahisha. So what is the inference here? A sin would be not appropriate, but if we're speaking about something that is probably at the highest level in how this is to be considered as not appropriate, then in that situation, that would be fahisha. Usually, in the Quran, the word fahisha is referred to zina, except in one ayah, when it said, الشيطان يعدكم الفقر ويأمركم بالفحشاء. Except in this ayah, the word al-fahsha was actually referring to avoiding and being selfish and greedy from paying the duty of zakah. Only in this ayah, but all the other ayat, al-fahsha is usually relating to zina. In other words, it's relating to, we're speaking about fornication or adultery. Now, the other thing is that sometimes the word fahish can also refer to something that is any transgression. Just like the Prophet ﷺ, when she was basically responding to the Jews that came to the Prophet ﷺ pretending to say Assalamu alayk, but the truth of the matter, they were saying Assalamu alayk, which is two different things. Assam basically means death. Assalam basically means peace. So they made it appear as if they were saying Assalamu alayk, but it was very clear and it was clearly audible to the point that is Sayyida Aisha, she was very offended by this. The Prophet ﷺ just responded, and upon you is what you had said, but she didn't accept that as a response and as a way to object to what they had basically said to the Prophet ﷺ. So she started basically yelling and scolding them and all of that. But the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تكوني فاحشة. Don't exceed the limit in how you basically would attack others, even if that was a Yahudi right there, a Jew coming to say inappropriate things against the Prophet ﷺ. I want to look at that one. So in other words, we're looking at il-fuhsh is any form of an aberration or any form of a transgression in behavior, in words, and certainly anything that goes against what is considered as righteous, anything that is going against righteousness, going against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has considered as a principle is basically considered as al-fahish. Now, what is the difference between fahish and mutafahish and التفاحش? Also in لغة عربية, we would say that الزيادة في المباني زيادة في المعاني. What does that mean? Any increase on the root of the word is basically to mean there's an increase in meaning. So we're increasing in the conjugation, and this conjugation is basically going to give me a new meaning, a new addition to that of the root of the word to give me a new explanation. So al-mutafahish is basically a person that induces an increased transgression in attacking people, or you could say that this person is purposely engaging in such an action, and this would be something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid. And al-fahish is a person that is sayyi al-khuluq. Al-fahish is basically a person. So now we're talking about the person that is basically lacking good manners. And التفاحش is when two parties are engaging in exchanging any form of an illicit behavior or probably even exposing it. That's التفاحش. So التفاحش would be whether we're speaking about people exchanging inappropriate, probably inappropriate words, inappropriate behavior, inappropriate, perhaps maybe attack of words, or perhaps also as well, it can be, التفاحش would be exposing the wrong illicit behavior. Okay, now here's one thing. Why is it important to stay away from fuhsh? Now, this is very important to understand. When we look at, remember Hidayat al-Tawfiq and Hidayat al-Irshad, this actually relates to it. So when you say Hidayat al-Irshad, if somebody is struggling to absorb Hidayat al-Irshad, they probably had Hidayat al-Tawfiq, the applied guidance. Their action is probably affecting their ability to process all that. And they're not seeing the truth. They're not seeing the truth because their behavior is dragging them towards deviation, towards falsehood. And that's why al-Ghazali, and I would say al-Ghazali is probably one of the most important scholars who died 505 Hijriya. You got to memorize that one. This one's pretty easy to memorize. Al-Ghazali is one of the most important scholars that had ever written. I mean, he's not the only one. You have a lot of different scholars that wrote about Tazkiyah, but certainly Al-Ghazali was probably one of the most important scholars to write about Tazkiyah, and certainly the most important book is called Ihya Ulumuddin, which was actually given service by al-Iraqi to oversee those ahadith and scrutinize those ahadith to make sure that we're getting a good classification of which ahadith are weak and which ahadith are authentic. So in that book that we talked about before, let's see, what is al-Ghazali's comment on why it's important to avoid il-fuhsh? He said that when people would use fuhsh, whether we're speaking about in tongue, in other words, oral fuhsh, oral type of an aberration, or whether we're speaking about behavior, all of that was forbidden because the source of an aberration and such a behavior is basically going to be one, you're either intending and your motive is to either harm, or it will be an action that you basically will embrace as a habit. And this habit will not happen unless the person is socializing with the people that engage in such an aberration. In other words, your social dynamic is going to be the main reason why, whether you're saying words of aberration or whether it was a behavior, it really started with you putting yourself in the wrong environment. And this environment affected the way that you think, the way that you behave. And certainly, this is a behavior, this is an action of such group of people. Certainly, it is not from the Salihin. So with the people that are misguided, they're going to see it as funny. They might think of it as cool. They might think of it as it makes you look more masculine. It makes you look stronger. It makes you look somehow that you're liberal, you're open-minded. But the truth of the matter is that such a behavior was only seen as something that was appropriate, that is, it's cool, etc., was only seen as such only by the people that practice it. But a salih person would never see it as appropriate. A salih person would never see such an action to be an action that they would embrace, because a salih person would not behave in such an action because a salih person had lived hidayat al-irshad with their vision to only see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would approve as a principle. And in Hidayat al-Tawfiq, in their applied guidance, they had managed to basically live it as an integrity, as a habit, as basically a behavior that they would practice in their life. Let's see right there. So that's another explanation for the word al-khabithatu lil-khabithin wal-khabithuna lil-khabithat. We remember Surah An-Nur. Maybe we should go for Surah An-Nur for a bit and actually see this ayah right there. Let's go to that one because it relates to what we were talking about. I'm going to go to Surah An-Nur for a bit. So I'm going to go out of this one and I'm going to run to Surah An-Nur. And let's see, what was that, ayah 26? We're going to run to Surah An-Nur. It's going to be right there. Hold on, let's find it. Surah Al-Furqan. We're going to find it in Surah An-Nur. Here we go. And we're talking about ayah 26. Actually, no, that was ayah 26 right there. So let's see. Yes, that was ayah 26. We're going to go to it. Let's see what it was actually talking about. I want you to look at it. So ayah 26 right there. Here's the ayah. الخبيثات للخبيثين والخبيثون للخبيثات والطيبات للطيبين والطيبون للطيبات أولئك مبرؤون مما يقولون لهم مغفرة ورزق كريم. And some scholars actually said الخبيثات للخبيثين. This is talking about the words that are rejected of that person. If it's an evil word, then it belongs to evil people. If we're speaking about evil behavior, that would actually belong and go back to basically people that have an ill intention. And same thing if we're talking about good. Good behavior, good words are basically coming out of good people. Good people would basically produce good behavior, and therefore we're speaking about the people that would only, of course, within the context of this ayah, who was actually this ayah referring to? Well, was basically referring to those that got involved in talking about hadithat al-ifk. That was the context of this ayah. But I want you to look at this one. Then it talks about يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تدخلوا بيوتا غير بيوتكم. Do not enter homes that are not your homes unless you are basically given the permission to do so. Once you enter, there's a certain gesture, there's a certain greeting that you basically would bring in when you enter this home. In other words, how you relate with the society, with your presentation, basically comes in with what really was stored in your brain, in your heart. Your hidayat al-tawfiq is basically projecting and displaying what was stored from the hidayat al-irshad. Connected with that one. So the way you greet people, the way you present yourself, that's basically going to affect what was stored inside the brain. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then goes, of course, with certain rulings about lowering the gaze and letting us know that, hey, what affects your behavior, or let's call it hidayat al-tawfiq, your applied hidayah, is really, hey, what processed in your eyes? What data did your eyes collect? What data, whether we're speaking about men or whether we're speaking about women, what did they look at? How did they relate with the different fitan that they might see on their phone, or the social relations? How did they relate with the social relations that surround them? And certainly that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving us such instruction, and then at the end and lets us know that in order to find such a hidayah, you got to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your place of hidayat al-irshad. Allahu nuru samawati wal-ard. مثل نوره كمشكاة فيها مصباح. The light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's so apparent. It is not something that would be lost. It is not something that would be hidden, as it is as clear as this light that would on its own be radiating its own light, exactly like the ayah that was describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's light, exactly like the light that would be in a niche, and this would glow without even having any fire touching it to try an attempt to light it. Where do we find these people that have this iman in their heart, that have this hidayat al-irshad in their heart, this guidance of information, or informed guidance, or let's call it the revelation guidance? Where do we find them at? That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, في بيوت أذن الله أن ترفع ويذكر فيها اسمه. That's where you would find them. You would find them busy in the houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically doing that dhikr throughout the night and throughout the day. And these people, they would be so committed to connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that nothing will pacify them away from such a dhikr and such a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why the ayah was letting us know that they are what? That they're رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ ذكر الله. Nothing will pacify them away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not any business, not any trade, anything, nothing will basically not pacify them away from dhikrullah or even performing their salah or doing their zakah. Why? Because of this key thing. يَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا تَتَقَلَّبُ فِيهِ الْقُلُوبُ وَالْأَبْصَارُ. This is a key ayah right there. How did we get, if somebody is struggling with hidayat al-irshad, how do we fix it? You fix it by khawf. You fix it by fear. Fearing what? You fear the day when the hearts are trembling, and when the eyes are trembling from the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that fear in dunya of what will happen on Judgment Day will basically be what will be protecting them on Judgment Day. The fear in dunya of that what would be coming up on Judgment Day is basically what will be protecting them on Judgment Day, inshallah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِيَجْزِيهُمُ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنَ مَا عَمِلُوا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them even better than what they had done, and He will increase them from His bounties, and the Lord Almighty will give them the provision from what He has without anything in return. Now, how did we get there? Why did I want to get there? And certainly, when we see these ayat, we're basically trying to understand. Let's go to that ayah that we were doing, or at least that page that we were doing just earlier, right there, al-khabithuna, al-khabithatu lil-khabithin. And that's basically to let us know and just remember really quick, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about al-khubth itself, it basically goes back to the same thing that we were talking about, what's affecting Hidayat al-irshad, and finding guidance in your vision, is basically the behavior itself. Al-fuhsh is considerate as a cancer. It is exactly like a cancer. It starts out with a small tumor, and then in stage 1, it's growing until it basically starts going all over your body, and then it metastasizes, and then it goes and basically kills that person's heart, kills that person's body, kills that person's brain, basically by going into their spinal fluid, and then it basically just goes all around their body, and then this person is basically dead. And that's the same thing when we're speaking about nur, just like in the ayah of Surah An-Nur, and how we basically had scrutinized those ayat. In nur can go from your heart, from hidayat al-tawfiq, to going around the body in a positive, in a good way. And same thing on the other hand, il-fuhsh. It can start out as a sin, and then it becomes a practice, and it grows, and then it affects the body and metastasizes in that person's body, and can affect the person's heart, the person's brain, and then their hidayat al-irshad basically turns off. Hidayat al-irshad turns off basically from what? From a fuhsh that started out as perhaps a sin. It's exactly like a cancer. So when we look at that, what is the ruling on committing الفحش then? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً قَالُوا وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهَا آبَاءَنَا وَاللَّهُ أَمَرَنَا بِهَا قُلْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَأْمُرُ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ. What did they say? When they were committing wrong behavior, they said, well, everybody's doing it. We had seen our ancestors doing it. In other words, they were trying to normalize it as something that everybody else is doing it. Why are you making it a big deal? What, are you not introduced to this kind of word, these kind of words, or these kind of behaviors? What is wrong with you? Or a Gen Z wording might actually use the word noob, or might use something that this is a place of this person being a country person, a traditional person, a person that is so backwards or traditional, and the list goes on and on. But what they don't realize is that this was something that was mentioned by the previous nations that wanted to normalize their kufr and basically said, وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهَا آبَاءَنَا. Everybody else is practicing it. Our ancestors were doing this all those generations that had passed. What's a big deal? Why are you making it such a big deal? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَأْمُرُ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ. Say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not order for people to commit any form of fahsha, any form of an illicit behavior, any form of such aberrations. And therefore, you're basically claiming things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is approving it by thinking that, hey, if it's approved by the society, if it's approved and normalized by the society, then there's nothing wrong with it. قُلْ أَمَرَ رَبِّي بِالْقِسْطِ. And say and stand strong and speak in confidence and determination and say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders for what is just, for what is righteous. And how do I stay committed? He said, أَقِيمُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ. You want to stay committed. You want to stay determined on haqq. Simple. He said, face your faces. Let your faces be where? Go to the masjid and worship the Lord Almighty in sincerity, in submission. And you will see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take you back to where? كَمَا بَدَأَكُمْ تَعُودُونَ. Whether كَمَا بَدَأَكُمْ تَعُودُونَ, meaning that your return is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Judgment Day, or كَمَا بَدَأَكُمْ تَعُودُونَ, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring you through the fitrah. Why? Because الفاحشة is going against the fitrah. What is الفطرة? الفطرة it is part of your instinct that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you to be basically a person that would recognize good as good and bad as bad, and that acts as, think of it as the router within your heart to basically collect the signal. Okay, this is like the Wi-Fi, the router that basically connect the signal of what? Of hidayat al-irshad. But if this router is basically broken, even though hidayat al-irshad, or the signal, or basically perhaps maybe the internet connection is out there, but your router is broken, so therefore it's not going to pick up those signals. And that's the same thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know that كَمَا بَدَأَكُمْ تَعُودُونَ. Your router on the inside may malfunction and not pick up the signals if fahisha was basically coming in as a virus and certainly as a cancer to malfunction your fitrah. So كَمَا بَدَأَكُمْ تَعُودُونَ, is this referring to fitrah, or is this referring to Judgment Day? At the end, we know if we're talking about the context of fitrah, كَمَا بَدَأَكُمْ تَعُودُونَ, as in terms of fitrah, that which basically within the context, you will see it has a high, it has a good support of such an interpretation when we say كَمَا بَدَأَكُمْ تَعُودُونَ, referring to fitrah, that what will bring you back to the fitrah in order to come back to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you in, that pure fitrah, is basically when I go to the masjid. But فَرِيقًا هَدَى وَفَرِيقًا حَقَّ عَلَيْهِمُ الضَّلَالَةُ. But who takes us to such a trajectory of one group of people? Some people would basically choose guidance. Other people would basically come to the trajectory of finding nothing but misguidance. How do they come to that trajectory? They came to that trajectory by basically putting in the practices that led to such consequence, that led to such trajectory. You practice Iman throughout your life, the chances of you dying on Iman is basically very probable. But if you had been engaging in the wrong practices, then you will most likely die in that state. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know, how did these people get into such state? How did these people come to the trajectory of where they would be finding themselves basically living in misguidance? That's why the ayah continues. إِنَّهُمْ اتَّخَذُوا الشَّيَاطِينَ أَوْلِيَاءَ. They had basically taken the shayateen as their resource, as their the area of decision making, the area of what they would consider as the area that would guide them, basically. And then it wasn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they would live under the impression يحسبون أنهم مهتدون. They would live their life under the impression and under a strong sense that they are basically guided, but they're living a self-manipulation. So how do we correct our behavior in making our, let's consider it as the router to pick up the signal, our heart, our fitra, our mind, to pick up the signal of that hidayat al-irshad in order to find ourselves putting hidayat al-tawfiq, to get basically a good speed connection, a strong connection in our heart with hidayat al-irshad, to come in and see it as hidayat al-tawfiq, and we'll be getting a good connection within our hearts. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then emphasizes, "O sons of Adam, take your beautification when you go to the masjid." So what does that mean? Zinatakum, where this is talking about your zina is how you would celebrate. That every time you go to the masjid, make it a celebration. Make it that you are so happy to go to the masjid, and that the masjid is basically the most important destination that you would go to. How do I fix my hidayat al-irshad? Al-masjid is one start, but there's another part. وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ. The second part, what you eat. You want to make sure you're doing portion control. You want to make sure what you eat, you want to recognize and understand whether we're speaking about the substance that you're eating or whether we're speaking about portion control. إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ. If you're not portioning those amounts of food, you're going to see that it is also going to be affecting your ability to stay committed to hidayat al-tawfiq. So, قُلْ مَنْ حَرَّمَ زِينَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي أَخْرَجَ لِعِبَادِهِ وَالطَّيِّبَاتِ مِنَ الرِّزْقِ. We're not telling you not to enjoy all the different halal items, but where the ayah is letting us know, so, well, I'm not telling you to not take and not consume something that is halal, but I want you to basically keep it within the limit. إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ. Do not wander, do not waste the different potentials, the different rizq, the different energy, the different resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us. So just keep in mind that you will get this Yawm al-Qiyamah in Jannah. And that's basically given to us by understanding the different resources in al-ayat to make sure that we understand how to keep ourselves away from fahisha. So, how to keep ourselves maintained? So the ayah continues, إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّيَ الْفَوَاحِشِ. Know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid all the different fawahish. What type of fawahish? We're speaking about external fawahish, behavioral ones, or even internal ones. What is there such an internal fahisha? If I swear at somebody internally, does that mean that I'll be held accountable? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that there's a fahisha that can be practiced internally without you realizing. Or you could be saying it on the inside. You could be perhaps maybe just thinking evil of someone, or probably having su'idhan in someone, or probably have the wrong intention. You just want to harm that person because one day they probably harmed you. You just want to harm them, and you are enjoying that this person is harmed, that this person is struggling. That's ithm. البغي بغير حق. البغي and transgression. Even if the other person may not know exactly what you're doing, but that's fuhsh. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that fuhsh is more comprehensive than someone catching you doing that behavior or something that is probably exposed publicly, but al-fuhsh can be something that you might be doing internally, or you might be doing it in ways that no one else knows that you're probably scamming that person, or no one knows that you're probably sneaking, or you're probably trying to gather some information. You're probably so slick in getting some ways to probably influence and create some different effects to basically suit your interest, but not the other person's interest. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know, do not say the wrong things on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or give misguidance, or give wrong fatwa. Make sure you go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to see what is right is right and what is wrong, to make sure you're not confusing your elements. You're not confusing your hidayat al-irshad or hidayat al-tawfiq. You need to go back to learn Islam. You need to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make sure you basically have everything in place. And that's why Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, he basically wrote a book. It's called al-Zawajir. It's not that big. It's almost 250 pages. Not too big. But in that book, he basically collected all the different things that are considered as sin. And he said one quote. He said, مُلَازَمَةَ الشَّرِّ وَالْفُحْشِ مِنَ الْكَبَائِرِ. He said one thing is that if a person is consistent in practicing evil or practicing illicit behavior, that in itself is basically a major sin. What is the evidence? The Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ شَرَّ النَّاسِ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ مَنْزِلَةً يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ مَنْ وَدَعَهُ النَّاسُ اتِّقَاءَ فُحْشِهِ. Ya Allah. He said the worst of the people, that is the Prophet ﷺ saying, the worst of the people in their status on Judgment Day, or the people that would, are the people that are avoided by others just because this person uses this type of illicit language or illicit behavior. So why is this person abandoned? Well, because they continuously use probably this word or that word, or probably this behavior, and people just abandon them or avoid them because of their actions, because of the evil that they would display. And certainly another evidence, when the Prophet ﷺ actually said, إِنَّ الْفُحْشَ وَالتَّفَحُّشْ لَيْسَ مِنَ الْإِسْلَامِ فِي شَيْءٍ, that the Prophet ﷺ had said that al-fuhsh, that illicit behavior, illicit talk, is nothing of Islam. In other words, it does not belong to Islam. And the best of the people, إِنَّ أَحْسَنَ النَّاسِ إِسْلَامًا أَحْسَنُهُمْ خُلُقًا. The best of the people are the people that have the best manners, the best behaviors. Those are the best people. And certainly, this is just a small portion. Just a small portion. And certainly we can see that during our society, people are practicing fuhsh as if it is a norm. That's why the Prophet ﷺ had warned us of that. And he said, إِنَّ مِنْ أَشْرَاطِ السَّاعَةِ الْفُحْشِ وَقَطِيعَةُ الرَّحْمِ وَتَخْوِينُ الْأَمِينِ وَأْتِمَانُ الْخَائِنِ. Part of the signs of Judgment Day is certainly al-fuhsh, when it becomes a practice, it becomes a norm, and avoiding or abandoning the women relations. Women relations, what are we talking about? Women relations. Women relations, we're speaking about abandoning the sisters, and for different reasons. Perhaps maybe sisters, perhaps maybe aunts, perhaps maybe mother, etc., and accusing and giving themselves the justification that they're small-minded, or I don't like it when my mom says this, or when my sister says this. Being good to the sisters, or to the mothers, or to the women that are rahim. Who are the rahim? Rahim, we're speaking about mother, we're speaking about sisters, we're speaking about maternal aunts, paternal aunts, and certainly nieces. Those are rahim. Those are rahim. Therefore, train your sons, Train your sons, and even your husband, if he didn't call his sister, didn't call his mother, yes, maybe she has an attitude, but you have the responsibility to do silatul rahim. You have a responsibility to do silatul rahim, and certainly encourage your husband, encourage your sons to learn how to reach out to their aunts, to learn how to reach out to their sisters, to learn how to always ask about them. Well, how is everything with you? Do you need help? Do you need support? Etc. This is silatul rahim. This is part of Islam. Takhweenul amin. What is takhweenul amin? Takhweenul amin is when a person that is of good integrity, a person that is religious, a person that is basically a trustworthy person, he's basically described, and people will describe him as a person that lacks integrity, a person that is lacking trustworthiness. Is that even a word? Okay, well, basically accusing him of committing some form of a behavior that's making him not trustworthy or her trustworthy, and and when certainly the person that is nothing but a kha'in, a person that you cannot trust, people are trusting them. We know that these people are involved in all these wrong behaviors, but certainly these people become the politicians. These people are portrayed and seen by people that they're good people, that they're basically giving us good things, and they're probably portrayed as if they are the experts and all of that, without us realizing that they're actually the ones to lack that expertise, or to lack probably the trust. But of course, it becomes so common, such a norm, that people are basically endorsing the wrong people. And such an endorsement, it becomes, on the other hand, also perhaps putting down and scolding also the wrong people, where a person of religious integrity gets accused probably of wrongdoing. And a person of wrongdoing is presented as smart, as an expert, as an influencer, as good, and then people would seek their advice even on things that they're not even specialized to talk about. Allah al-Musta'an. Okay, so due to time, as I promised, that we basically want to stay committed to time, making it an hour and a half. And I know it's a lot of information, but inshallah, because I had been absent basically the past, well, not the past week, but the week before it. So we're going to make up certain classes. And if you want, we can do tomorrow, continue our tafsir in English and also in Arabic. We can do that, unless you don't want to make up classes and you want to leave it for Sunday. Well, my Sunday, well, what does that look like? Your Saturday. There you go. So yeah. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Or if I had missed out on something, I'd be happy to, inshallah, we can look into it. The next class, we'll be talking about basically, let's say, the ruling on such a practice, which is gayism, and what is the ruling on that. And we'll be going into more of a fiqh debate, discussing that. So stay tuned. It's going to be, now we're probably going to be finding ourselves shifting from tafsir to fiqh, but that's okay, because that's how Tafsir al-Qurtubi is basically designed, and it's designed in a combination of fiqh and a combination of tafsir. So inshallah, we'll continue it next time, inshallah. All right.
But tomorrow we have class.
I don't know. What do you guys think? Yes.